Hey guys, this is Zadia, Janelle, Logan, and Megan, and we're here to talk to you about the Egyptian culture.
So, hope you enjoyed the video. For our transcultural theoretical framework, we chose the description of a theory are a set of interrelated or concepts that give a systematic view of a phenomenon or an observable fact or event that is explanatory and predictive in nature. So, for our theoretical framework, we chose in order to guide us through the cultural assessment was the five-component model for developing cultural competence by Chimpenya, Bacca, Day, and Munzuns. This model was used as a guide as we evaluated the culture and created culturally competent interventions for care. The five components of cultural competence are cultural awareness, cultural knowledge, cultural skill, cultural encounter, and cultural desire. For cultural awareness, it involves self-examination and in-depth exploration of one's own cultural and professional background. According to Catalano, merely learning from another person's culture does not guarantee the nurse will have cultural awareness. Nurses must first understand their own cultural background and explore the origins of their own prejudices and biased views of others. Cultural knowledge involves a process of seeking and obtaining information based on different cultural and ethnic groups. Nurses can develop and expand their cultural knowledge base by accessing information offered through a variety of sources such as journals, textbooks, seminars, workshop presentations, internet sources, and university courses. Cultural skill involves the ability of the nurse to collect relevant cultural data regarding the client's presenting problem and accurately perform a cultural-specific physical assessment. The elements of this model are communication, space, social organization, time, environmental control, and biological variations. Cultural encounter is the process that encourages nurses to directly engage in cross-cultural interactions with patients from culturally diverse backgrounds. Directly interacting with patients from different cultural backgrounds helps nurses increase their cultural competence. Development of cultural competence is an ongoing process that continues throughout a nurse's career and cannot be mastered. Lastly, cultural desire refers to the motivation to become culturally aware and to seek cultural encounters. Inherent in cultural desires is the willingness to be open to others and accept and respect cultural differences and to be willing to learn from others as cultural informants. The Egyptian demographics include: Egypt is the most populous country in the Middle East and the third most populous in the African continent. It has a landmass of 886,900 square miles and about 1.5 times the size of Texas. The population of Egypt is 78 million people. 95% of land is desert, and 90% of people live on only 3% of the total land area due to water resources. The population is mainly settled near the Nile River. The population grows by 1.4 million per year, and 90% of the population is Muslim dominated. The Egyptian religion and spirituality is: most of the population is Muslim, mostly Sunni. The history of the Christianity in Egypt dates back to the beginning of Christianity itself. Many Christians hold that Christianity was brought to Egypt by the Apostle St. Mark in the early part of the 1st century AD. Religious practices are done during deaths, marriage, and religious holidays. Egyptians have 2 wedding ceremonies. One is a religious and the other is civil. The civil ceremony is performed by the mosque's imam and another social ceremony in which friends and family gather for gala evenings. A separation for the religious ceremony is considered a divorce, but it is customary for brides and grooms to live together only after the social celebration has taken place. Egyptian American Christians have one religious marriage ceremony. Family and friends pray for each other, invoking good health, cure of illness, and peace. Muslims who can't afford the expense or in good health make the pilgrimage to Mecca sometimes during their lifetime. The belief that when they are ill, they are at mercy and under control of God, and that He has a particular reason for their suffering. To lose hope may mean that they are losing faith in God and His abilities. The ancient Egypt god and goddesses represent aspects of Egyptians' natural and supernatural surroundings. Specific gods include Ra, son of God, and Nut, goddess of the sky. Nursing interventions that we came up with for religion and spirituality include being present for them spiritually as well as medically, encourage prayer during their times of distress and worry. Prayer is an important aspect to them, especially through illness. Also, be aware that their spiritual practices after death and let them grieve outwardly.
So now we're going to talk about different Egyptian family roles and functions. The role of an Egyptian mother is that the mother keeps a lot to herself. She works in the home to prepare meals for families and does not spend much time outside of the home. The mother also cares for the upbringing of her children and has little to no role in the community life. Although the mother is kept from society, this does not indicate that she is viewed less than a man. This is a concept of gender complementary in which the Egyptians believe that this is a message of the religion, that everyone has their own role in society and not one role is better than the other. The father is the one who is in charge of making money for the well-being of the family. Most husbands in society only have one wife, but the pharaohs marry many just to ensure they're higher of the throne. The men maintain societal structure and dominate gender construction, therefore support keeping the women in the home, opposed to the women working and abandoning their primary roles. The children are very attached to their parents for the rest of their lives. They have a lot of respect for their parents throughout their lives. There is so much respect that the eldest son is responsible for taking care of the parents when they age and no longer can take care of themselves. Young men learn to trade or craft from their fathers or an artisan. Wealthy boys are sent to school at 7 to study religion, reading, writing, and arithmetic. Young women work and receive training at home from their mothers. Some girls were taught to read and write at home. Women marry around 12 to men that are a bit older than them. In ancient Egypt, the birth of a child is considered the most magical event, and childbirth customs were heavily influenced by religious beliefs. Women are threatened with divorce unless they conceive within the first year of marriage. Women giving birth were most commonly attended by midwives and female relatives. It was customary for women to deliver babies while squatting on 2 large bricks painted with religious scenes meant to invoke the gods' protections. Care of children in Egypt. The lower class families have the mothers take care of the children. Families of the upper class have slaves and servants take care of their children. If the family could not have a child, the couple would pray to the gods and practice magic to conceive a child. Care for the elderly. Children were expected to look after their elderly parents. This is due to society instructing children to repay their devotions of their parents. The firstborn male inherited the land, while the daughters inherited the household goods such as furniture and jewelry. There's one quote that I'll read now. It says, "Repay your mother for all her care. Give her as much bread as she needs and carry her as if she carried you, for you were a heavy burden to her. When you finally born, she still carried you on her neck, and for 3 years she suckled you and kept you clean." Decision-making for an Egyptian family. The man is formally considered the head of the household and the one who makes the decisions for the family. Egyptian men are in charge of controlling the family's budget as well. During immigration, family roles change as the stress forces them to share decision-making.
Now there are death rituals that for the Egyptians, and so for the first thing is that they usually bury the deceased as soon as possible after they die. Rituals include cleaning the body and wrapping it in a white cotton wrap. And during a funeral-type ceremony, verses from the Quran are read and a special prayer is recited at the mosque before the body is buried in a simple tomb underground. They don't believe in fancy tombstones, so their tombstones only consist of their name written on and placed above the tomb. This is a sign of equal with death when meeting their Creator. The night of the burial ceremony, friends and family will meet in a tent outside the deceased's home to give respect and condolences to the family. No food is usually served, but Turkish coffee is usually provided. And then 40 days after the burial, another ritual takes place for mourning. This also takes place in the deceased's home. This also has verses and passages read from the Quran. This is meant to console the family of the deceased, and a ceremony similar to this one is usually provided every anniversary of the death. Egyptian American death rituals are similar to those of the American Christian death rituals. Although immigrants from Egypt perform their own spiritual rituals, such as an Islamic burial which rituals are done in designated cemeteries. Like the spiritual rituals that would be performed in Egypt, the Quran would be recited and the mourning ritual observed for 40 days after the burial. Although the annual anniversary death observance is usually not done by immigrants here in America. Some Egyptian immigrants will fly their deceased family members to Egypt to be buried, although this means having to get approval from both countries and a special casket, which all can be an expensive process. And then those in healthcare can help with the process of death and planning with Egyptians because a plan for the deceased is rarely thought out until death actually occurs. And then next is bereavement. So Egyptian Americans tend to have more anxiety than Americans about death, and this was found during a study by Abdul Khalek and Ahmed. Sorrow and grief are common responses to death, and a public reaction of crying is an expected demonstration of their grief. Otherwise, the community may see them as lacking affection for the deceased. Older Egyptians are not seen to fear death and its closest, but as a journey toward another world which is perceived as better than here. They do believe in the afterlife and expect good deeds during human life to be rewarded. They also believe to be reunited with others who have been deceased. The nursing interventions for the death and bereavement is it is important for family to grieve with the patient during end of life, so make accommodations that allow family to be with the patient. Make time for prayers to be read from the Quran. This is where they receive their peace and how they send off the deceased. Allow this public display of grieving, as this is a common act of sorrow and a necessary act for their culture. And then discuss plan of care for death with the patient and family. Egyptians only have their burial site planned usually and nothing beyond this planned ahead of time. So next is the communication, and this is the language part of it. So the dominant language of Egyptians is Arabic. Written Arabic is common and the same throughout all Arab countries, although spoken Arabic does not always follow proper grammar and can be different. There are many different types of dialectal Arabic, like Saids for the south and Nubians for the north. Those in the desert speak Bedouins, and although there are different types of Arabic, there are no noticeable communication barriers among themselves. And those Egyptian Americans, they can usually speak English to other Americans, but in settings with others who speak Arabic, they will switch intermittently from English and Arabic. Outsiders will usually see these conversations as angry and chaotic because their speech gets heightened in tone and pace. They have many values that govern interaction patterns amongst other Egyptians. The first is respect or ihtiram, and this is expected when talking with those who are older and those in higher social positions than themselves. Another value is politeness or adab, and this is what is appropriate, expected, and socially sanctioned. They may sacrifice truth and reality for politeness, and they will slowly tell people of an illness or bad news because it is seen as not polite to share these things directly and quickly. Yes. So next is communication of the nonverbals. So Egyptian nonverbal communication is incredibly expressive. With these Egyptian Americans, they usually speak with expressive words and gestures while using many body and hand movements. They usually communicate just as much nonverbally as they do verbally, and facial expressions are used by these Egyptians are direct reflections of how they are feeling internally. Touch is commonly used with them and used frequently. They tend to touch each other while speaking to get attention or to emphasize something. And Egyptians have their own communication through facial expressions. So some of these include the wide-eyed look to a child to tell them to stop, a wink to an adult to tell them to watch what they say, and not looking at someone shows dissatisfaction. They believe people who do not sustain or make eye contact should not be trusted, and although in traditional folks whom are strangers, those may avoid eye contact to show respect and modesty, and children are taught not to stare because it is seen as disrespectful. And for the communication through touch, men will incorporate touch into all communication, even with strangers, and this is the same with woman to woman, and family members and friends of the same gender will kiss one another on both cheeks. Those of different genders will shake hands, and even though touch is so important in their culture, men and women generally do not touch one another. Touch is accepted between different sexes only between husband and wives and in private. The more religious, the less touching between sexes there usually is. Strict Muslims do not touch the opposite sex, not even handshakes, as it is considered a sin, and a head nod is used to greet one another in these circumstances. And Egyptians in Egypt are allowed to publicly hold hands or embrace one another, but those in America tend to have weariness relating to touching those of the same sex in public, and will just give a hand on the shoulder as a sign of friendship. And then these greetings are usually shaking hands while standing, and not standing can be considered rude or an insult, and these greetings can be a handshake or may just be a head nod. For the nursing interventions for communication, we said be mindful of the gender barriers as to not disrespect them. Men usually only touch other men and vice versa with women. Ask them before starting an assessment if they would prefer a nurse of the opposite gender. Then stand when communicating with them, as it is seen to be rude to be sitting. You can take a lot out of their facial expressions, so be attentive in noticing pain or internal feelings being expressed through these facial features. Egyptians tend to touch to create a trust bond and to communicate effectively. You may touch them to show trust and to put more emphasis on what you are saying. Egyptians tend to become very elaborate, both nonverbally and verbally, so be aware and that they may seem upset, but they may just be excited. Next is the spatial distance. So Egyptians tend to be very close to one another, so they sit and stand in very close proximity to one another. They tend to have minimal personal space boundaries, and although men and women have different personal space boundaries during interactions with one another, women usually keep male friends at the same distance as male strangers, and so when they do get in close proximity, eye contact is usually automatic and expected. So nursing interventions for spatial distance would include be respectful of the patient's personal space, especially for those of the opposite gender, and let intentions be known when entering their space, but do not be afraid of getting close as they are comfortable with closeness. And then when in close contact with a patient, make eye contact. And so next is the time. So older Egyptians believe in the past as they reminisce about the past and the good days. Younger Egyptians will live in the present and future. They believe the future has many promises and opportunity. Social time takes priority to other scheduled appointments, so guests are expected to arrive late. So they are usually around 1 to 2 hours late is what is expected. Upon business meetings, even if scheduled for 10 minutes, they could take much longer because it is expected to offer tea, coffee, or other beverages to visitors. And then when Egyptians are meeting with Americans, they refer to American time and are on time, but with other Egyptians, they will use Egyptian time and be late.
With nutrition, there's a lot that kind of goes into this. The housewife is responsible for feeding the family. Egyptians, they don't eat pork, so they prefer to eat kosher meat. They actually fully cook their meats and will never eat it rare. Dark leafy vegetables and green herbs are a main ingredient in this culture and are associated with many of the dishes. Germination, sprouting, and fermentation are all practiced still to enhance the quality of the nutrition state of their foods. So kind of like us, they have food groups. They include cereals, legumes, dark leafy green vegetables, other vegetables and fruits, cheese, oils, and white and red meat. Like mentioned earlier, they kind of have a more vegetarian diet, which you'll see in the video. So they believe that meats aren't very good for them. So they like to stick to the vegetables and cereals and such. They do believe that their ancestors set them up for health and prosperity through their diets. The first meal of the day is small, consists of a drink either by itself or with a small piece of bread. It's really considered more like the drink that consists of breakfast. Then they actually have their Friday breakfast, which refers to the meal eaten leisurely or with the family. So basically the very first meal is kind of like a setup for breakfast. And then they have their big breakfast where they like to eat with the family. And it's kind of seen as a trend that all of their big meals would like to be with the family. The fellaheen is a smaller meal that we would refer to as lunch. So when you have a busy work day and whatnot, you eat lunch by yourselves or with your coworkers. And that's just a smaller meal. And then the main course is what we see as dinner. So after the holy holiday of Ramadan and Small Eid, they will bake a wealth of cookies, and this is kind of seen as a tradition in their culture. During the Great Eid feast, they sacrifice a sheep, and they actually give the meat of that sheep to the needy families. So food is seen as a sign of good health. So the more you eat, the better health is expected, and they see that because they believe that when the ancestors set them up for health and prosperity through their diets, the food is actually what provides that healthy lifestyle for them. Rice is a staple in every meal, and Egyptians prefer not to drink liquid with their meals as they believe that the fluid doesn't allow for as much room for the food that they need to eat. Fertile and easily cultivated soil positively impacts the abundant amount of cereals and vegetables that can be grown. So the land is known for positively impacting their nutrition. But when rain becomes heavy, the soil is then unable to produce life for their crops, which this would leave them with no food, which they see as obviously an unhealthy way of living. So Egyptians do have food preservation techniques that they gathered from the ancient times for when this does occur. This is kind of why dry foods occupy their diets. They want to make sure that they do have an abundant amount of food if flooding was to occur. There are portions of Egypt that are high in poverty, and then in this case, it is seen that not all of the food groups are achievable in that daily diet, which then again is seen as unhealthy lifestyle. Again, in poor conditions, the mother and the child will eat first, and then the men will eat what is left over. Since the men are seen as stronger, they can hold off more with nutrition. They also see that wasting food is not an option. There are a lot of people who could benefit from the extras, so they say that, eat all of your food. That way we're not wasting any and everybody can get satisfaction from their meals. Some deficiencies, those that live in rural areas tend to have fat-soluble vitamin and iron deficiency anemia. So they eat more fresh fruits, vegetables, and enriched or whole wheat grain breads. These Egyptians tend to eat more sweets and processed food when they immigrate to America. So then they have high diets in fats and then less in fresh foods. And this could be a problem for their health. They don't like to mix sweet and sour or hot and cold during meals as a preference. And some of the Egyptians actually practice drinking milk with yeast to increase vitamin B intake. So some nursing interventions we came up with for nutrition was encouraging iron-rich foods and or supplements to decrease the susceptibility to that fat-soluble vitamin iron deficiency anemia that we might see in some Egyptian patients. Also, encouraging fluids to prevent dehydration from the hot African climate. Obviously, anywhere where it's hot and it's humid, fluids need to be encouraged. Otherwise, a patient could really suffer from dehydration. And then allowing family members to gather around during mealtime so that the patient is able to engage in their cultural norm of being with the family while eating. That's really important to make sure that they're comfortable in the setting that they're in. And also asking the patients if there are any additional special accommodations that they would like to be made when mealtime arrives. Sometimes we might not know what their preferences are for mealtime, so we want to make sure that we're asking and doing our best to make sure that that's able to happen. So, health-seeking behaviors and health promotion behaviors in the Egyptian culture. The Ministry of Health and the Health Insurance Organization are kind of like the government of Egypt's healthcare, and they actually only cover public healthcare facilities. It covers government employees and school-age children only. So if you're not in those categories, unfortunately, you basically don't have health insurance. Their sense of health promotion behaviors includes cleanliness and good hygiene. They get their practices from the Quran, so they use the prayers from there to also promote their good health. Obviously, they think that praying and God or their God distinguishes your health and your well-being. If applying for work in Egypt, it's required that you show a negative AIDS test. And also, if you're vacationing from Sudan, proof of other vaccinations is required for entry. So if you're from Sudan and you are vacationing to Egypt, you have to show proof of your vaccinations upon arrival to the country. Malaria is a prominent virus that spreads in Egypt. So as we know, malaria is spread through mosquitoes. It's recommended that when traveling to Egypt, a person receives the preventative malaria treatment, which is important so that they do not get that disease while they are visiting. So there are a couple of different definitions of health to the Egyptian culture. We thought all of these were important, so we're just going to go ahead and mention all of them. Egyptians believe that any option necessary to save or prolong life is welcome. This includes blood transfusions and organ donations, things that we might see in other cultures as, not options for living. They believe in nurses and physicians, but when it comes to westernized specific practices, such as acupuncturists and chiropractors, they're a little bit hesitant. Also, it'll be mentioned later, but, a lot of them like to seek religious care. So instead of going to a hospital, they'll go to a mosque and they will get health care from the people there that can provide it for them. So they tend to pick and choose, or in other words, shop for their practitioners. They believe that what causes illness is a lack of hygiene, exposure to disease, or environmental conditions. They believe it's up to God, again, to choose who gets sick and who does not. And another thing that we thought interesting was that in the Egyptian culture, it's actually seen that abstinence can rid the body of disease and bad health. So here we are again with health practices and practitioners. Egyptians, they actually, like I mentioned, prefer to go to private doctors than rather seek healthcare from the government. Some Egyptians seek medical care from the mosque clinics. So this actually does not receive funding from the government. So if you are in those categories of working for the government or a school-age child and you decide to go to a mosque clinic, you will not get funding. Modern medical practices shape the majority of the Egyptian healthcare. However, some of the population still use traditional remedies. And a common one is for nasal congestion. They'll take a spoonful of honey and lemon juice, and they'll use that to treat their congestion. Nurses in Egypt, unfortunately, only graduate from a high school program that is developed to meet nursing minimums and to compensate for the nursing shortage. So, we do see poor nursing care in Egypt. So here are some nursing interventions for health. By being educated on the Egyptian perspectives of healthcare and illness, while also being sensitive to their cultural values, we can enhance the healthcare experience for these patients and their families. We know that it's not just about the patient, but it is about their family as well. Being aware of the many herbal remedies they use, and we can ask them about these before administering medications. You know, what kind of other medications do you use at home, and how do you believe that that affects your health? Taking time to listen to their views on healthcare, not only to educate ourselves, but to be able to educate them also on things that they might not even know can be helpful to their health. And when patients are unable to attend to their hygiene, making sure that their bodies are clean to the patient's expectations of clean. Again, you know, they see that good personal hygiene dictates your health, and you know that is really true. So making sure that we're taking the time to really extend their care on their personal hygiene. So some cultural restrictions and sanctions. The Muslims must pray 5 times a day. In the holy month of Ramadan, all Muslims are to fast from dawn to dusk and can only work 6 hours in a day. So what fasting means is you can't eat, drink, chew gum, or smoke while you're in public. And then each night, the families will actually get together and they break the fast. So they have a big feast. Some cultural sanctions. A man's word is considered bond. So when a man does not follow his word, he is bringing dishonor to his family. Pretty shameful thing. People are to dress how their finances allow. So this is actually what distinguishes the wealthy from the poor in the Egyptian culture. And then social class is determined by family history rather than actual money and wealth. So some nursing interventions, just being mindful that some practices might not be accepted in their culture. Like we mentioned earlier, most of them are, but we want to make sure that we're making them comfortable. Being supportive if the patients are choosing to fast during the holy month of Ramadan. That can be a stressful time when your when your body is unable to contain any food. Asking if there's any special cultural accommodations that they would like us to make during their healthcare experience. And then just helping patients to attend prayer time during the specified times that their culture states for them. So here are references. We did gather a few. If there's a double asterisk by that, those are evidence-based articles. And then also our citations for our pictures as well. So we just want to thank you for listening to our PowerPoint. We really enjoyed looking at the Egyptian culture and kind of seeing how it correlates with American culture, but then the differences as well. It's really fun to see some things that we didn't know. And thanks again.